Hey everyone, I'm going to do opening remarks now. I'm sure everyone can still hear me. I'll wait for the first person in the chat to say yes, and then I'll go. Fabulous. So hello and welcome to the first day of the 100 Years with and Without Kropotkin Conference. And thank you so much for your contribution to the event, whether it be in attending, speaking, or even organizing the conference. We have speakers from all over the world, including the United States of America, Britain, Germany, Iceland, Quebec, and Russia. And I believe that we have attendees from even further around the globe. I'll just speak briefly now about Kropotkin's life before touching on some general conference admin. It was 100 years, 6 months, and 17 days ago that Kropotkin died. He was born in Russia in 1842 to an aristocratic family and attended a prestigious military academy in his teen years and was being groomed for a position high up in the army, possibly even close to the Tsar. And in 1862, at the age of 20, he graduated top of his class and entered the army. He served in eastern Siberia, and it was here he was first introduced to anarchist ideas. In the late 1860s, he resigned from the army to pursue a career in geography and began to read political and scientific literature voraciously, and was disowned by his father. As he entered his 30s, he became involved in activist networks and was imprisoned in Russia in 1874 for this. In 1876, he escaped from prison and fled Russia, and he would live in Switzerland and France before settling in Britain in 1886. The southeast of Britain would be his home for the next 31 years, as he stayed there until the Russian revolutions of 1917. And it was in Britain that he would write and publish most of his influential works. But as always, his influence and his networks extended out across the world, but especially in France, Russia, and America. His most famous works, such as Mutual Aid, A Factory in Evolution, Fields of Factories and Workshops, Conquest of Bread, and Memoirs of a Revolutionist, come from this time period. It was also in Britain that he would learn of his brother's tragic suicide in a Russian prison in 1890, one of the most harrowing events of his life. He always deeply missed Russia, however, and even debated returning home in 1905 during political unrest in his homeland, to which his friends intervened and told him it was too dangerous. And eventually in 1917, he would get his wish and would return to the country of his birth for the first time, as far as I am aware, in 41 years. And 4 years later, he would die in Dmitrov, a town 50 miles north of Moscow, at the age of 78. Throughout his 78 years on this earth, he fulfilled a great many roles. He was a philosopher, a geographer, a zoologist, a biologist, a historian, an economist, an ethicist, a political scientist, a journalist, and an activist. But also, just like many of us here, he was a parent, a sibling, a spouse, and a friend. Throughout the conference, we will discuss his life, but also importantly, the century of his afterlife. And I hope that this conference helps us better understand how he lived and felt, but also how he outlived his brief time on this planet, as we all hope to, through his ideas, his actions, and his personal relationships. We will now take a brief break before hearing the first papers at 10:30 a.m. British time, which is approximately 18 minutes from now. And first up, we have our panel, Kropotkin and His Ideas, with Michael Grooff and Zoe Baker speaking, who I think are already in the chat, which is nice. And then later we have our panels on Kropotkin and global ecologies and Kropotkin in new areas. Can I ask that all speakers plan to be 10 minutes early for their panels so that we can set up and test audio, video, etc.? Throughout the papers, also please feel free to ask a question in the chat, but we would appreciate as much interaction as possible, and so would encourage people to ask in the chat if they could ask their question over video and audio. But it's completely fine if people just want to write in the chat. We completely understand, so we don't want to, but we think it would facilitate better camaraderie between attendees. Yes, and then if you request to share your video and audio, then we as organizers can use Hopin Delay to do so. And lastly, if anyone is having trouble with the tool, Hopin, the conferencing tool, I mean, at all, there are a few YouTube tutorials that you can have a quick look at during breaks or during quite a long lunch break. And thank you again for coming. And I shall see you all in the next panel in now 17 minutes.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Right, great. I'd like to extend the welcome that Sean just gave and also thank him for making the conference happen, as well as to all the other organisers, all the speakers we have, and to everybody else watching. I'm sure we're in for a productive and enjoyable conference, beginning with this opening session. This opening session we've called Kropotkin and His Ideas, and hopefully that's a nice introduction, and we'll hopefully lay the foundations for the question and answer session here, and also further discussions in this conference. We have two speakers for you in this session. We're going to begin with Michael Grooff, whose presentation is called The Engine of Mutual Aid, Kropotkin's Bipartite Account of Sympathy. And this will discuss how sympathy is the driving instinctive mechanism behind mutual aid. This is going to be followed by Zoe Baker's presentation on Kropotkin's definition of anarchism, which as we shall see is complex and varies throughout his works. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to present their paper, and this will be followed by a question and answer session at the end. And without further ado, I will hand this over to Michael. Michael, are you ready now?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers, the other speakers, and also the attendees. Yeah, I'm just going to jump straight into it because we don't have that much time. I hope I'll be able to get the PowerPoint working properly. That should be working. Okay. So my paper is titled "The Engine of Mutual Aid: Kropotkin's Bipartite Account of Sympathy." I think we all know roughly what mutual aid is here. That it's a, very briefly put, a tendency for life really to cooperate rather than compete, because it gives a greater advantage in the struggle for life. And I got really interested in the idea of, or in figuring out what exactly is behind this mutual aid. So what drives it, both in terms of why it happens, but also how it happens. I think those two questions kind of are intrinsically connected. So very quickly, when researching this, you stumble upon the concept of sympathy. And I think this is a very interesting concept to discuss today, both because it relates to some of Kropotkin's greatest influences, namely Adam Smith and Charles Darwin, but also because it shows the relevance of Kropotkin throughout the 20th century and even today. And I'll be touching upon some connections we can make with, for instance, phenomenology. My main sources here are the text Anarchist Morality, which is found in, among other books, Fugitive Writings. And this is sort of backed up with some sections from Mutual Aid and Ethics as well. I do want to say before I start the rest of the presentation that I'm mainly interested in what we can do with Kropotkin's ideas, not so much what he himself intended. I'm not trying to, when I'm looking at his use of sympathy, I'm not so much trying to sort of analyze the psychology behind it. So I'll be talking about a certain confusion that you can find in Kropotkin's texts. And this is mainly a confusion that is in the text. I don't really want to comment on whether or not he was confused about it or how he saw it himself. That being said, I do think it's important to note that I'll be talking about sympathy in relation to empathy. And empathy is a term that both in French and in English, which are two of the main languages Kropotkin wrote in, had not been invented. It was invented, the term empathy was invented in 1909 by Titchener as a translation of the German Einfühlung. So without further ado, let's get into it then. So my main argument will be the following. I'm going to be looking at Adam Smith's simulative sympathy, as I will call it. This is the main form of sympathy that Kropotkin subscribes to. And I will connect that to actual textual evidence to show that Kropotkin indeed takes up this concept of sympathy and uses it and critiques it in his own theory. Then I'll state my main problem with assuming just Adam Smith's concept of sympathy, namely in relation to animals. I'll then propose my second, so in the bipartite account, the second account of sympathy that I will argue is also in the same texts. I'll very briefly connect that to the phenomenological concept of empathy. But more importantly, I wish to show that the perceptual account is very useful when we're thinking about ethics, particularly with Kropotkin. And I'll show that it might be a good way of solving the problem of sympathy in animals, which we find in the Smithian account. So if I can, there we go. So Adam Smith is taken up by Kropotkin because he is looking for the origins of morality, and he rejects God, he rejects religion, law, even self-interest or egoism, and he says that Adam Smith is correct in finding the origin of moral sentiments in the feeling of sympathy. And so the first step is then to go back to Smith, and Smith states that, I quote, however selfish man may suppose to be, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So he's looking for the origin of the moral sentiment, and this is sympathy for Smith. And then I'll quickly go through a second quote just to get Smith's literal description of sympathy. He says, by the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. So Smith's idea of sympathy is that we are capable, through imagination, to imagine ourselves in the situation of another that we can observe. And because we imagine ourselves in their situation, our imagination gives us sentiments which would, generally speaking, be similar to the ones that the person we observe has, although they would be weaker in degree because they're imaginative rather than direct or primordial. Smith emphasizes in his text that it is not the direct observation of expressed emotions or of the person themselves, but that it is specifically the observation of someone's situation and a subsequent simulation of their emotions, which leads to sympathy. So this is important because Smith is of the opinion that sensations only exist in the minds, and so sensations of the other only exist in the mind of the other. And so we only have access to what we can perceive in their environment and not their passions themselves. Because of the imaginative nature of sympathy, we can also sympathize with someone who's completely unaware of their situation, either because of simple ignorance or because they're unable to do so. And Smith takes this very far as an argument, and he says we can even sympathize with the dead. So he says, it is miserable, we think, to be deprived of the light of the sun, to be shut out from life and conversation, to be laid in the cold grave, a prey to corruption of the reptiles of the earth, to be no more thought of in this world. And it's very clear here that he's saying that sympathy is something, is an ability we have to sympathize that is specifically based on situation. We put ourselves in someone else's situation, because if it was based on the person with whom we sympathize, then obviously we would never sympathize with the dead. So Kropotkin takes this up, and he says it quite explicitly. This is what I call the damning evidence. He says, Smith has laid his finger on the true origin of the moral sentiment. He does not seek it in mystic religious feelings. He finds it simply in the feeling of sympathy. And later says, Adam Smith's only mistake was not to have understood that the same feeling of sympathy in its habitual stage exists among animals as well as among men. So Kropotkin takes it up, but the only problem with Smith is that he he does not really address animals in general. He doesn't say that animals can't do it, but he ignores it. And Kropotkin says, well, that's a mistake. Clearly, animals also have sympathy. So I quickly want to go through some textual examples to show that this particular definition or this particular concept by Smith is taken up and used. I think the central example that Kropotkin uses in the anarchist morality text is one of a man beating a child. And he says, you see man beat a child, you know that the beaten child suffers. Your imagination causes you to suffer the pain inflicted upon the child. So here we see the Smithian sympathy, and it comes back in more passages. He says, the more powerful your imagination, the better you can picture yourself what any being feels when it suffers. When this happens, the man substitutes himself in imagination for the person opposed to him. And even in his description of sort of the general moral law, in a very descriptive sense, he says that the way we act and the way most beings act is to treat others as you would like to treat them, or as you would like them to treat you under similar circumstances. So here we see again that the sympathy is necessary. We have to be able to imagine ourselves in someone else's shoes in order to follow this rule. And again, it was Adam Smith's idea that we mentally apply these acts to ourselves and picture ourselves in the condition of the sufferer. We see this in ethics as well. So it's not something that only appears in this one text. It comes back throughout his work. But there's a problem with this, I think, because as a factor of evolution, mutual aid applies to all life, effectively. Kropotkin mostly speaks of animals, but I think we can take the concept of mutual aid and even apply it to fungi, plants, etc., etc. And Kropotkin does speak of microbes in anarchist morality. He says, are not the earliest aggregations of cell use themselves an instance of association in the struggle. But sorry, just need a very quick drink. I think the problem that becomes quite obvious is that although humans are able to use imagination to put themselves in another person's shoes, and we can imagine some animals being capable of the same thing. If we look at very complex or very intelligent animals like dolphins or maybe dogs, elephants, we might have the same thing. But at a certain point, if we look at more and more organisms, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that they would have simulative or imaginative sympathy. And certainly with microbes, it seems rather silly to imagine that, or to think that they could imagine themselves being other microbes. So clearly the Smithian theory doesn't work directly. And so we have to think about it more to actually solve it. Yeah, if we grant simulative sympathy to higher animals, we cannot reasonably expect all life to be capable of sympathy in this manner. So then we get to Darwin. And Darwin, frankly, I think, misinterprets Smith, but he does say something very interesting, namely that sympathy is something that has become instinctual. So he claims that the way Smith describes it may have been how it happened originally, but now it is an instinct. And this is interesting, but it's also a problem, because if it has become an instinct, that makes the problem worse, right? That means that instincts, if something has become an instinct, then it would have had to happen imaginatively in the past. But generally speaking, if we look at evolutionary timeline, there are a lot of instances where earlier forms of life were less complex, and so then we're moving the problem and we're making it worse at the same time. In any case, we can use this concept of instinct as Kropotkin does. So Kropotkin speaks of the habitual stage as opposed to instinct, or as opposed to sympathy in general for animals. And even when he's talking about humans, he says that usually we act morally from habit. And Kropotkin sort of blurs the line sometimes between habits and instincts, meaning somewhat the same thing. But, oh, sorry. The problem, however, is that moving to habit or instinct as an explanation for sympathy doesn't actually solve the problem. At best, referring to instinct moves the problem a step back anyway, and at worst, it obscures the problem, because now we have the same question, not what is sympathy, but what is an instinct, and how does it work? How does the instinct of sympathy function? So we still have a question of what the mechanism behind the instinct or the habit is. So Smith's theory is clearly inadequate, but at least he answers some of these questions. I think instinct in some way is kind of a keep out sign, insofar as it indicates that there is something there, but we can't see it. And so this is why I kept looking in the text, and I found, in my opinion, a very convincing reading that I'll now argue in favor for. So to return to the example of the child being beaten, Kropotkin writes, your imagination causes you yourself to suffer the pain inflicted upon the child, or perhaps its tears, its little suffering face tell you. My emphasis. And again, he says, when we witness the misery of others, we are capable of living through it within ourselves, and we call this feeling commiseration. Again, later in the Ethics, to show that this happens in multiple texts. But in both cases, we are looking at perception. We're not talking about imagination. We're looking at perceiving the tears, perceiving the suffering face, witnessing the misery of others, which goes directly against the Smithian account, or the imaginative account, where Smith says sympathy, therefore, does not arise so much from the view of the passion as from that of the situation which excites it. So I think this is the first evidence that Kropotkin is taking up Smith, but he's doing more than just copying Smith. Smith doesn't only make one mistake, which is not applying to animals. Smith makes a second mistake, which is limiting himself to the imagination. Then there's a problem for Smith, or for Smith that would be a problem, which is the fact that the sorry, I don't have a timer. Thomas, could you tell me how long I still have?
Hello, Michael. You've still got about 5 minutes left.
Oh God. Okay. Oh Jesus. Okay.
It doesn't matter if you want over a little bit. It's fine.
Okay. So I think we'll just skip this. And so the main point I want to make here is that Kropotkin moves away from this idea that Smith has that. Okay, good. Thanks, Sean. Kropotkin moves away from the Smithian idea that passions are simply in the mind, and as we've already seen in the child example, the expression of emotion is very important. Passions don't exist just in the mind; they are expressed, they're lived in the body, and this solves one of the main arguments that Smith has against directly perceptual theories of sympathy. I think another very important example where Kropotkin's perceptual account comes forward is in this example of the scanty rags example, I like to call it. It says, when a woman takes off her own scanty rags to cover another woman who is cold, while she herself shivers on the deck of a vessel, she does so because she would suffer infinitely more in seeing a hungry man or a woman starved with cold than in shivering or feeling hungry herself. She escapes a pain of which only those who have felt it know the intensity. So here we clearly see two very important things. First of all, our sympathetic pain is not necessarily merely derivative and therefore weaker in degree, because in this example we see that the pain of the woman who is sympathizing is greater than the woman with whom she sympathizes, assuming that the pain of cold would be equal for both persons. Moreover, we see that the pain experienced through sympathy is not of the same kind. This is clearly a kind of emotional pain, which is very different from pain of the cold. And so following all these examples, I think it doesn't come as a surprise that Kropotkin speaks of a moral sense, and he says, I quote, he calls it, I quote, a natural faculty in us like the sense of smell or touch. So sympathy is not just a natural faculty as it is in Smith, but according to Kropotkin, is one that is comparable to perceptual senses. So I'll very briefly connect this to empathy. So Kropotkin's perceptual account corresponds to the phenomenological account of empathy, where empathy is the ability to understand other states of mind or being. It's similar to perception and imagination, but it's its own thing in most phenomenological theories. And there are very strong philosophical parallels and historical parallels. So in empathy, the phenomenological account of empathy is one that is opposed to a kind of empathy that is imaginative. But I think I'll just skip through this because I am running out of time. So what I wanted to say is that we can use phenomenological theory to better understand these kinds of problems or these kinds of concepts in Kropotkin. So one I've already discussed is embodiment, the idea that our emotions, our passions are embodied, which is central to a lot of phenomenology. Secondly, I think intentionality is a very useful concept here. So intentionality in phenomenology refers to the fact that all acts or forms of consciousness are about something or are directed towards something. And we can see with sympathy that sympathy has a different intentional object than the mental state with which we sympathize. So if we sympathize with the beaten child, the child has an emotion of pain, of misery that is directed toward the physical pain, directed toward its abuse, whereas our sympathy has as its intentional object the misery of the child. And so we have access to the misery of the child, just not in exactly the same way as the child itself does. And making this distinction, again, is what allows us to escape the arguments by Smith. Yeah, so I do want to point out that sympathy and empathy are distinct, and if we follow a perceptual account, we still lack an explanation of how we move from empathy, so from understanding the suffering of the child, to sympathy, so caring about or caring for the child, although this undoubtedly happens. The connection is given in Smith's theory because rather than going from understanding to caring, we feel the passions of the other first, and then we project that, and that is how we understand others. But that comes with two major problems ethically, I think, and this is another reason why a perceptual account, I think, is very important for understanding Kropotkin. So first of all, it's too easy. If we need to sympathize with others in order to understand them, then that means that we would always have to care about others if we are to understand them, and that doesn't work. Many times we are able to understand the passions of others without having to sympathize with them. We can be desensitized to particular passions. We can have any experience of not caring, how harsh as it may seem. But I think there's a bigger problem if we stick to just the Smithian account, which is the one that Kropotkin explicitly mentions, which is that it makes ethics too hard, in the sense that if we are only able to care about others because because it's mediated through the self and our own passions, then it appears impossible to truly care about the other as another. Sympathy ultimately becomes a fellow feeling with yourself and not with the other if we just follow the imaginative account. And that would mean that we could only care about others by caring about ourselves, and this inevitably seems to lead to some ethics of self-interest, which is something that Kropotkin explicitly rejects, precisely because he centralizes care for others in his morality. So Smith's account is useful, but it's useful only in, as Kropotkin says, 1% of cases. And we need to. I think it's important to use this perceptual account to further understand what's going on. So now I want to quickly go back to animal sympathy, and then I'm done. I'm very sorry, organizers. So microbes can't imagine things was our problem. But if we understand sympathy according to phenomenological empathy, according to a perceptual account, then we can see that empathy is an ability to understand states or mental states which are embodied or expressed through the body, whether deliberately or not. And through our bodies, we express our needs, and through sympathy, others are moved to meet them. And I think, contrary to the imaginative account, I think we can imagine animals being able to do this quite easily. That is, Kropotkin calls sympathy at a certain point in ethics. He says sympathy is a recognition of equity, and I think that's precisely what's going on here. Through our bodies, we express our needs, and we're moved to meet them. And we can apply this kind of theory of sympathy to all life, because even though microbes might not be able to experience complex emotions, which they would be able to communicate, they can perceive each other and communicate on a very fundamental level. And based on this, even the simplest forms of life can cooperate, and that is practice mutual aid. And so using a perceptual account, we come to a situation where the differences between microbes and humans are differences in complexity. And to borrow a phrase from Darwin, they're differences in degree rather than kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It was very interesting. We have more time to discuss this in the Q&A session, and I can already think of several questions that I want to ask you. But first, we're going to go to Zoe. Zoe, you ready to give your presentation?
Hey, can everyone hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay, I'll just jump straight into it. So, how Kropotkin defines anarchism is a very complex topic that can be difficult to work out. So perhaps his most famous attempt to define anarchism is his 1910 Encyclopedia Britannica article on anarchism. And this is the one that gets kind of referenced the most. So like Peter Marshall in Demanding the Impossible says, I basically followed the approach of Kropotkin in the Britannica article. So Kropotkin famously begins the article by writing that anarchism, the name given to a principle or theory of life and conduct under which society is conceived without government, harmony in such a society being obtained not by submission to law or by obedience to any authority, but by the free agreements concluded between the various groups. And he says that in such a society developed along these lines, the voluntary associations, which already now begin to cover all the fields of human activity, would take a still greater extension so as to substitute themselves for the state in all its functions. So he appears to be saying anarchism is a vision of a free society without the state. And then he says that anarchists are the left wing of socialism and advocate not only the abolition of the state, but also the abolition of the wage system and capitalist production. He then claims that this opposition to the state and capitalism goes alongside anarchists advocating specific strategies to achieve their goals. So they advocate revolution, they reject seizing state power or participating in the existing capitalist state by parliamentary politics, and they advocate what Kropotkin calls the direct struggle against capital by the labor organizations. So he's gone from saying anarchism is a vision of a society without a state to saying anarchists, anti-state socialists who advocate a specific kind of strategy to achieve their goals. And then he does something which is really conceptually strange. He goes on to discuss anarchism as if it has existed throughout human history prior to the emergence of either capitalism or socialism. He writes, "The conception of society just sketched and the tendency which is its dynamic expression have always existed in mankind in opposition to the governing hierarchic conception and tendency, now the one, now the other, taking the upper hand at different periods of history." Kropotkin then decides to locate this tendency towards an anarchist society within A, the social history of humans creating horizontal forms of association in response to different forms of class rule, and B, the intellectual history of individual authors and theorists advocating the abolition of the state. So in the realm of intellectual history, Kropotkin labels a highly eclectic number of thinkers as proponents of the anarchist conception of society, such as early forms of Taoism in China, the Stoic Zeno in ancient Greece, dissident forms of medieval Christianity like the early Anabaptists. And this crucially includes Kropotkin anachronistically imposing the category of anarchist onto the past. So he claims that Zeno was, quote, the best exponent of anarchist philosophy in ancient Greece, and then asserts that during the late 18th century, the radical Enlightenment thinker William Godwin was, quote, the first to formulate the political and economical conceptions of anarchism. Kropotkin then moves to the 19th century and describes Proudhon as the first person to use the name of anarchy with application to the no government state of society. When discussing anti-statist ideas in the 1840s, Kropotkin once again uses the category of anarchist in an anachronistic manner to refer to people who never called themselves anarchists. He claims that the left Hegelians Moses Hess and Karl Grun were proponents of, quote, anarchism, and describes Max Stirner as, quote, the fullest expression of individualist anarchism. Kropotkin then says that what he calls modern anarchism, as opposed to just anarchism, first emerged in the Federalist wing of the First International during the early 1870s. And he claims that this occurred due to a divide within the socialist movement between supporters of social democracy, who advocated parliamentary politics, and anarchists who rejected this in favor of direct action, especially within trade unions. Now, despite thinking that the Federalist wing of the First International is the origin of modern anarchism, Kropotkin doesn't limit the category of modern anarchism to the ideas of this group and its direct ideological successors. Rather, he claims that modern anarchism has developed in four main directions. These are American individualist anarchism, such as Benjamin Tucker, who are the successors of Proudhon's mutualism, anarcho-communism, which includes obviously Kropotkin himself, Christian anarchism, such as Tolstoy, and then a quite strange category he calls literary anarchism, which seems to basically include any author who expresses an idea that's kind of similar to anarchism. So he says that Kropotkin claims that there are hundreds of modern authors expressing anarchist ideas or libertarian ideas, which have influenced the development of anarchism. And so he includes John Stuart Mill, who was a liberal and massive supporter of colonialism, Herbert Spencer, who wasn't an anarchist, Nietzsche, not an anarchist, Richard Wagner, not one, Alexander Herzen, not one, Ibsen, Walt Whitman, and Thoreau, and also Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he says these are kind of people expressing anarchist or libertarian ideas which have influenced anarchism, even though all the people he lists, they generally don't advocate anti-statist socialist ideas or anything similar to like what we would call modern anarchism, even if they influenced anarchists read them. Now, Kropotkin's Britannica article is, at least for me, extremely confusing. Like, I've read it so many times, and each time I kind of leave it more confused. So he says that anarchists are the left wing of socialism, and then moments later says Zeno was a proponent of anarchist philosophy, even though Zeno was writing in ancient Greece, thousands of years before the invention of socialism or capitalism. When writing about the ancient and medieval world, he makes it seem that to be a proponent of anarchist ideas, a person need only advocate a free, stateless society. Yet when he's in the 19th century, he doesn't include Marx and Engels in the history of anarchism, or people like Blanqui, even though they advocated the long-term goal of abolishing the state and wanted a stateless, classless society, and so surely should be included in this, even though they supported, from Kropotkin's perspective, state socialist strategies to achieve this goal. If he excludes them, then why not exclude figures like Godwin or Zeno, given that they don't advocate the same kind of strategies to achieve a state society. In some cases, kind of they advocate state society but don't propose any real way to like achieve this goal. Now, the topic of how Kropotkin defines anarchism only gets even more confusing when you look at other things he wrote. So there are several examples in the 1880s and 1890s where he defines anarchism as only referring to a specific form of anti-state socialism, which first emerged in the 19th century. So I'll just give a few examples. So in 1883, Kropotkin says, well, he's on trial in Lyon, that I have been accused of being the father of anarchism. That is too much of an honor. It was Proudhon who first stated it in 1848, and Bakunin and other socialists who popularized it. Then in 1886, he gives a speech in Paris, which is subsequently reprinted in Le Révolté under the title of The Place of Anarchism in Socialist Evolution. And he begins the speech by saying the following. He says, "You must often have asked yourselves, what is the cause of anarchism, and why, since there are already so many socialist schools, it is necessary to found an additional one, that of anarchism." And then he proceeds to argue that anarchism, so understood, which is a socialist school that had to be founded and so didn't exist before, occurred in response to the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, industrial capitalism, and early socialism. So historically specific events which have not occurred throughout history. And to give a final example, in 1887, Kropotkin writes an article which begins with him referring to anarchy as the no government system of socialism, and then he proceeds to define it in the standard way of advocating the simultaneous abolition of capitalism and the state. So Kropotkin seems to have two definitions of anarchism. He defines anarchism broadly on some occasions in the Britannica article as referring to anyone in history who's advocated or attempted to build a free stateless society. And yet in other parts of his Britannica article and numerous other texts, he defines anarchism narrowly, where it's only a historically specific form of anti-state socialism, which first emerged in the 19th century, and crucially was committed to specific strategies such that you can exclude people like Marx and Engels from anarchism. So to me, this is like a huge puzzle, which is Kropotkin contradicting himself? And there are a few kind of obvious thoughts one might have of how to kind of show that Kropotkin isn't contradicting himself. So the first one would be to say that Kropotkin has his own private view of what anarchism is, but he changes how he publicly defines it depending upon who his audience is. So in the Britannica article, he adopts a really broad definition because he wants a popular audience to think, wow, anarchism has such a long and prestigious history. It isn't this kind of new, strange idea that people with beards are advocating in the 19th century. It's existed throughout human history. It's not this kind of wacky idea. And then when he's writing for a smaller anarchist audience and anarchist papers, he's like, Kropotkin says that it's just this historically specific form of anti-state socialism, which he subscribes to. The problem with this solution is that it doesn't match onto the evidence. So his 1887 remark that anarchy is the no government system of socialism was originally published in the 19th century, which was a magazine that was a mainstream monthly publication, and it had a large audience of around 20,000 copies per issue, which is greater than a lot of the kind of smaller anarchist papers Kropotkin was published in. Now, a second potential solution is that, well, Kropotkin just changed his mind. So in the 1880s and 1890s, he has this narrow definition of anarchism, and then from 1910 onwards, he adopts a broad definition. And so we might think this occurred in response to Kropotkin simply reading loads of history and discovering that anti-statist ideas have existed throughout history, and maybe having lots of conversations with Max Nettlau about this. He spent like a lot of time trying to find all the different kinds of precursors to anarchism around the world. Now, the problem with that narrative is that, like the previous one, it doesn't match onto the evidence. So he has a 1896 article called Anarchism, Its Philosophy and Ideal, in which he says that during the 19th century, a new interpretation of the past and present life of society has arisen under the name of anarchism, and it is a constitutive part of the new philosophy in the sense of the modern scientific worldview. So this new way of thinking has arisen, which is distinct from previous ways, and it's called anarchism. And he then defines an anarchist society in a way which is almost word for word the same as his Encyclopedia Britannica article. And then Kropotkin crucially writes that this conception and ideal of society is certainly not new. When we analyze the history of popular institutions, we find the same popular tendency to constitute a society according to this idea. And Kropotkin then claims that anarchism is distinct from these previous forms of advocating a stateless society because, quote, it is only today that the ideal of society, where each governs himself according to his own will, is affirmed in its economic, political, and moral aspects at one at the same time, and that this ideal presents itself based on the necessity of communism. And to give another example, there are also cases after the Britannica article where he again defines anarchism in a narrow way, where it just means anti-state socialism. So in 1913, he writes a letter to the French Anarchist Congress, and that was then reprinted in Freedom in 1914. And within this letter, he repeats the narrative from the Britannica article and elsewhere that throughout human history, there have been people who've created free associations in opposition to kind of hierarchical society. But crucially, he repeats this narrative without labeling them as anarchists, and instead only uses the term anarchism to refer to the contemporary version of this anti-authoritarian tendency. So he writes, so far as we know anything about the history of human society, there has always been found in it two currents of thought and action, two different tendencies. There has been the authoritarian tendency, represented by the wizards, the priests, the military chiefs, and so on, who maintain that society must be organized by a central authority, and that this authority must make laws and be obeyed. And in opposition to this authoritarian current, there's always been the popular current, which crucially calls the popular current, not anarchism, which worked to organizing society, not from above downwards, but on the basis of equality without authority, from the simple to the complex. And he says that from the earliest times, these two currents were found struggling against each other. They continue to do so, and the history of mankind is the history of these struggles. This second current is represented now by the anarchists. And he then specifies that the anarchists are anti-state socialists, they're committed to individual freedom, and in virtue of this, advocate the abolition of capitalism in favor of common ownership. And then he really commits himself to a narrow conception of anarchism. He says, this is why anarchy necessarily is communist, why it was born amidst the international socialist movement, and why an individualist, if he intends to remain individualist, cannot be an anarchist. So the kind of obvious response to this evidence is to go, okay, Kropotkin just changed his mind twice. So he thinks anarchism is this narrow thing in the 1880s and 1890s. He adopts a broad definition in 1910, and then by 1913, he's back to the narrow one, having realized he was mistaken. Kropotkin, however, decides to be confusing once again, and in 1913, in the kind of final edition of Modern Science and Anarchy, Kropotkin repeats the narrative, that throughout human history, there have been a struggle between authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism. And on this occasion, he labels the anti-authoritarian tendency as anarchy, and then says, quote, "In this sense, there have always been anarchists and statists." So anarchists have now always existed, and he's back to the broad conception. And he then says later in the book, "We already find anarchist ideas amongst the philosophers of antiquity, notably in Lao Tzu, in China, and in some of the earliest Greek philosophers." Within the same text, he says that William Godwin in the 18th century expressed, quote, "anarchist ideas," and was the first theorizer of socialism without government, that is to say, of anarchy. Which is, again, confusing because it's like he's just said that you have people like Taoists in China who are expressing anarchist ideas, and they've always been anarchists, and refers to the anti-authoritarian tendency as anarchy, but then says that Godwin is the first theorizer of anarchy, where anarchy means socialism without government, as opposed to just a kind of free society without a government. And this view is repeated elsewhere. So in his Ethics, he refers to Godwin as the first theorist of anarchism. So Kropotkin's confusing, and I have a potential solution for this, which I'm still kind of working out the finer details of, so this is a slightly kind of rough version, but he uses the term anarchism in three distinct senses. So we have A, the general vision of a future stateless society, which can be found throughout history. B, anti-state socialism, which Kropotkin holds was first advocated by Godwin in the late 18th century and is then independently reinvented in the 19th century by figures like Proudhon and Bakunin. And then for his third sense, C, a kind of anti-state socialism, which emerges from the 1870s onwards within the Federalist wing of the First International, and is committed to specific strategic positions which distinguish it from other forms of socialism that seek the abolition of the state. And he sometimes calls this modern anarchism, but other times calls it the anarchist movement, or just calls it anarchism. Kropotkin then switches rapidly between these three different senses of the term within the same text, and also between different texts, over several decades. So how can Kropotkin consistently do this? And I think that what's happening is that and I'm not sure if he was aware that he was making this conceptual move, but he's implicitly limiting his domain without telling the reader that he's doing this. So he writes sentences which are equivalent to saying anarchists, anti-state socialists, or anarchists advocate direct action by trade unions, whilst implicitly limiting his domain to the 19th century or the 1870s onwards. He can therefore make claims about anarchism within this specific domain, which are independent of any claims he makes about anarchism within the domain of the 18th century or all of human history. This is similar to how I could express the proposition, psychologists believe that serotonin exists, without committing myself to the view that psychologists prior to the discovery of serotonin weren't psychologists, or that psychologists have always believed in the existence of serotonin. This is because in saying that psychologists believe that serotonin exists, I'm implicitly limiting my domain to after its discovery in the 20th century, or once it's become widely accepted in the field. And I think that's what Kropotkin is doing, and that's a way to make sense of his the fact that he uses the word anarchism in these three different senses and keeps switching back and forth and doesn't use the same terminology, and it can be difficult to unpack. But I don't think Kropotkin was good at doing definitions. I think it would have been better if he just, for example, consistently used the term anti-authoritarian tendency or anti-statist tendency to refer to those ideas throughout history, and then only use the term anarchism once people start calling themselves anarchists. In this way, you can talk about its intellectual precursors without kind of being confusing, and without having the issue of, if he's consistent, he should be saying that Marxism is a kind of different wing of the anarchist tendency, in the sense of the tendency towards a stateless society, even if he thinks it's like the wrong tendency. But the same is true of, say, he has different views from other people he says are part of this tendency and disagrees with them, like Zeno or the Taoists or William Godwin. And so it's kind of then it's not that fundamentally different. I think he's just kind of inconsistent about it. Similarly, I haven't been been able to find yet examples of him calling kind of contemporary stateless societies when he's writing anarchists. Like, I've not seen him refer to certain kinds of egalitarian hunter-gatherers as anarchists, even though when he's, say, talking about these ideas throughout history, he does say that you have, anarchists in opposition to the wizards and the chiefs within those kinds of societies. So I don't really have a conclusion, but I hope that was clear, and that it gave people something to think about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Zoe. If anybody wants to ask a question to either Zoe or Michael, we invite you to request to share audio and visual and you can ask themselves. Or if you want, you can use the chat. I don't think we've got any questions yet, so Michael, I can ask you a question if that's okay. One problem I think with Kropotkin's account of mutual aid or sympathy is that he doesn't really discuss mutual aid between interspecies. So I was wondering if sympathy, does that extend between interspecies, would you say?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think just, are you asking what I think or what I think Kropotkin thinks?
Both.
So Kropotkin doesn't really tackle that question directly, but I think he does talk about. I think in mutual aid he does have some description of different kinds of birds living together.
I think he mentions it once with different ants and termites, but that's it.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting there is that he and this might be pushing it a little bit too much already, but he's talking about animals who do have very similar ways of expressing themselves. So if you're looking at ants and termites, or if you're looking at birds, and I think we have. Yeah, thanks, Sean. I think certainly with humans, you can. So humans and non-human animals, you can see that we are best capable of sympathizing with those animals that are most like us. Specifically, either if they have some particular tendency or characteristic about them that makes them seem very human to us, or alternatively, if they're usually very close to humans, sort of evolutionarily. So for instance, a lot of mammals are easier to empathize with than, say, ants, right? I think if we're talking, I think that's sort of what I think that's how I think about it, and also somewhat what Kropotkin might have said. But I do think it's a very interesting question. Yeah,
I agree. I think you've got the example when if we see a dog being beaten, it's very similar to the example of a child being beaten.
Yes. So
could be with eyes or something, similar eyes. Whereas if an ant being stepped on, that sympathy doesn't seem to hit us instinctively as the dog.
Yeah, well, so Darwin in his Descent of Man actually gives the example of a dog seeing its owner being beaten, and he says that if the dog is loyal and sort of moral, then the dog will help the owner. Now, Darwin is a very particular case that I don't want to get into too much here, but I think that's a good example as well that animals are also able to empathize with us, and I think using the if we're talking about that similarity that seems to be very important in sympathy, especially in perceptual sympathy, I think that's another way to see that it's very important to have that perceptual account and not just talk about imagination, because I think precisely because it becomes very clear that we're also able to sympathize or sort of attempt and perhaps fail to sympathize with things that don't actually have any experience, but that do seem very similar to us. So, for instance, robots and that kind of thing. Like, if you, I don't know if anyone has a Roomba or anything like that, but people are able to sympathize with Roombas even though they don't have any experience, and because even though we know that they don't have any experience, so we don't imagine ourselves to be the Roomba. It's just that when the thing is walking or driving around, and it exhibits certain behaviors that seem very lifelike, then we are still able to sympathize with them.
Yeah, I think the topic of AI and mutual aid is a whole nother discussion, but very interesting one to have. I don't know if anyone wants to come ask a question. They can request to come onto the audio and visual. But if not, I can ask a question to Zoe. And Zoe, my question to you is, do you personally think it's a problem that Kropotkin fails to sort of define anarchism? Because many times he speaks of, and I found a quote here, where he says that systems should be continually developed and readjusted in accordance with the ever-growing requirements of free life. So for me, it's sort of beneficial that anarchism isn't or doesn't have a rigid definition.
So I basically think Malatesta has already solved this problem, which is that he, in contrast to Kropotkin, and in part in response to him, makes a very clear distinction between anarchism and anarchy. So anarchy is a free, stateless society which is continuously transforming itself as people, find new kinds of oppression to dismantle or figure out new ways to organize society, which people in the 19th century, aren't in a position to conceive of yet. So anarchy is this never-ending process of what Malatesta calls the experimental system, brought from that of science to that of social realization. Anarchism is the movement to achieve anarchy. And anarchism is a movement to achieve anarchy, has for Malatesta a specific history. It emerges he says that the Anarchist Socialist Party has existed as a distinct tendency since Bakunin founded the Alliance in 1868. It became a global movement with the formation of this so-called Sympathy International in 1872. It has specific characteristics which you can absolutely define to distinguish it from other proponents of anarchy. So Marx and Engels advocate anarchy but aren't anarchists, or earlier or other kinds of stateless societies which already exist, which are doing anarchy but aren't anarchists in this limited sense of this social movement. And so I disagree with Kropotkin and think what he did was unhelpful and had kind of bad consequences for the historiography of anarchism. And I much prefer Malatesta's very clear, simple, straightforward distinction between anarchy and the anarchist movement, or just anarchism.
Thank you very much. Sean, I think you have a question. Oh, is the question's above you? Okay, hang on. So Michael Duckett has said, I'd like to see Zoe's final attempt at solving the contradiction, i.e. the psychologists believe that serotonin sentence. Would you like to address that, Zoe?
Well, I can copy and paste it into the chat. So in my draft, it's long. Oh, it's over the word limit. I will have to do it in several sections. Okay, so that's part one. And part two, and then part three. So yeah, it's like a philosophy. It's a thing that's kind of standard in philosophy of language, of people implicitly limit their domains, all the time, and both in terms of a temporal sense, what period you're speaking in. So if I say, I am a happy person, I can be implicitly be limiting my domain to now, and I'm not saying that I've always been a happy person at all stages of my existence. Or I can say that forms of the thing of historians believe X, which is say true now, but might not have been true in the 18th century when they had different views. And humans do this all the time. And I think this is what Kropotkin is doing, but because he doesn't have a background in philosophy, which I think is one of his weaknesses, is that he's really, really bad at defining things in like a rigorous and precise manner, and he often shifts between different definitions. And this isn't just for anarchism; he does this with a lot of different terms, which can make it kind of difficult to work out what sense he's using the term to mean, because he likes to shift between different senses. So like sometimes he uses anarchy to mean a state of society, but other times he uses anarchy to mean this really particular way of thinking about society based on modern science. And these two things obviously like different, but he uses the same word to refer to these two things. But yeah, so that's kind of like, I think you can use philosophy of language to work out what Kropotkin is trying to say, but isn't doing a very good job of clearly saying, because he wasn't a philosopher he wasn't like an analytic philosopher. He didn't have this specific kind of like conceptual rigor, in my opinion, despite being obviously very good in other senses. Okay.
So it's quite like a pragmatic definition of anarchism.
Or it's more like he has this really broad definition, and then he distinguishes between different subsets of it. So, you have a society without a state. A subset of that is anti-state socialism, which he thinks is invented by Godwin, and then a subset of anti-state socialism is, say, Proudhon or the anarchist movement. And so they all kind of, but he shifts between these three levels of which subset he's talking about, while using the same term to refer to all of them, and without saying that he's shifting between different domains of all of human history to the 18th century to post the First International, which means it can be difficult to figure out what he thinks.
So would you recommend that commentators on Kropotkin should always define which version of anarchism they're talking about when they talk about Kropotkin?
Well, I think they should be talking about what Kropotkin is intending to mean in this like specific passage. Because initially I used to think he changed his mind, and so his actual definition is the broad one, but he used to have the narrow one, and then the more I read, the more I realized that didn't work. So you can't do a straightforward, there's like a early Kropotkin who has this narrow sense, and this kind of later Kropotkin who has the broader one. Like, that could be an easy way to do that, but unfortunately he doesn't make it easy. So I think you just have to be clear about, in this bit, Kropotkin means it in this sense, and in this other bit, he's using it in this different way. But they are all crucially, they're subsets of one another.
Right, thank you. And Sean, I think you're next if you want to ask your question.
Hi, you can it's a question or a comment, sorry. But I was just going to say to Michael, when you were mentioning this, I didn't know that the term empathy wasn't coined until 1909, but I remember a very interesting thing reading about, there's a Scottish geographer called Patrick Geddes who wrote a book kind of about mutual aid and evolution. Him and Kropotkin were correspondents in the 1880s. But the very interesting thing about Patrick Geddes is that he was a botanist before he was a geographer. And he was really struggling for a term to explain how some plants, they effectively perform mutual aid without knowing. They're just both sustaining each other. I can't remember examples. Obviously, fungus is quite a good example. They often live off of another plant. But there's just quite an interesting story about how he couldn't find a word to describe that. It didn't exist yet. So he used the word symbiosis all the time, but kept explaining that it didn't mean no one is benefiting. Sorry, like no one is benefiting and one being punished. They're both benefiting, and there was no term for mutual beneficence because mutual aid hadn't been written yet, and sympathy didn't really fit. And I think there's quite an interesting thing I think there that connects to what you were saying about the kind of the imagination and being aware, because obviously to describe a plant as being sympathetic for another plant seems really farcical, especially in like 1870. But he couldn't quite work it, and so symbiosis was the word he used over and over again, or maybe he used the word mutual symbiosis, something like that.
Can I briefly comment on this? I think symbiosis is a really interesting and useful term to in a sense, to take the mutual aid even one step to lower complexity, in the sense that the sort of Smithian account of imagination is something that we can use to describe certain kinds of mutual aid or certain motivations for mutual aid that we have with very intelligent beings. So, for instance, humans. But that doesn't work for a lot of animals. So then we have to say, okay, well, there has to be something else that drives it. That is sympathy, as I've described it, as sort of perceptual sympathy. But I agree that, or I would say that at a certain point, when you get down to at least some forms of very simple life, you can't even say that it's sympathy in a perceptual level. It's not necessarily that the plants are in some way recognizing the needs of the other plant and providing it. It's even more simple that it just happens to work, and through selection, that is the thing that has continued to work. So I do think that's a very I appreciate the comment. I think that's a very useful way of thinking about it and sort of incorporating that as well into a very broad understanding of mutual aid.
I'd like to add another thing as well, if that's okay, which is kind of unrelated, but also to Michael again about so a lot of the lot of new liberals that I write about, liberals who are a bit later, who are like 1900 liberals, a lot of them subscribe to a theory of evolution that doesn't include simplistic animals, and that's their term, not mine, only complex animals. And I think it's just quite interesting that Adam Smith, they would have loved Adam Smith's economics, but they didn't talk about his evolutionary theory, and they got on board with Kropotkin. But they did the same thing that Smith did, in that, well, I guess they went slightly more radical. But it's just interesting that a lot of these, like within liberalism, the evolutionary theories never go like very far down the animal food chain, let's say, whereas the anarchist one, specifically Kropotkin's, do. I wonder if there's something to be said about both political philosophies there as well.
I mean, the sort of jokey comment you can make is that Kropotkin is working, bottom up instead of top down. But I do think there might be some connection between sort of the more the worldviews that are associated with anarchism or liberalism, as well as the anthropology or the philosophical anthropology, and how they relate to views of evolution and how life began and grew. But I would have to have a think on that.
Okay, we've got another question for Zoe from Soren. And that says, to what extent was Kropotkin responding to contemporary anarchist figures with his different definitions? For example, Tucker claiming anarchism doesn't need to be socialist in Armies That Overlap 1819. And he goes on to say, that is to say, not to different audiences per se, but according to current discussions in the movement.
So I think Kropotkin was aware of the kind of big feud that happened between the German immigrant anarchists and Tucker about how to define anarchism, where Tucker says that you can't be a communist and an anarchist and advocate the kind of revolutionary strategies they do. Therefore, anarchists like Most aren't actually anarchists, and they're kind of the fake inheritors of Proudhon's legacy. Well, Tucker and his friends are the true inheritors of Proudhon's legacy. I think that is what's motivating Kropotkin's. That's one of the things that motivates Kropotkin's remark in one sign in several texts, that in order to be an anarchist, you have to be a communist. And he claims that the Tucker's and Stirner's individualist anarchism would, in practice, result in a hierarchical society, and so they're not kind of consistent anarchists, you might say. But I think his shifting use of the issue is that he makes the exact same points in different texts, but uses different terminology to pick out the different things he's referring to, which suggests he has the kind of same view, but doesn't always express this same view in the exact same way, rather than him kind of responding to ongoing like debates, because like say the key debates, polemical debates between the American individualists and the immigrant German anarchists in America happens, before Kropotkin's writing the Britannica article. Happens in, I think, like the 1880s and 90s, while Kropotkin is continuing to use these kind of different ways of talking about the subject afterwards, and seems to kind of have a broad notion. He sometimes has this really broad notion of who is in the anarchist movement. So, in the Britannica one, he's like, yeah, well, essentially you have the individualists and they're part of it. Josiah Warren's part of it. And then in other texts, he's like, yeah, no, you should be a communist. I'm not really sure how he reconciles those two views, because he doesn't frame it as like, if you are a consistent anarchist, you should be a communist. He says that anarchism is necessarily communist, which I think has a kind of a stronger meaning. So I think part of it might just be that like, it's like not everything someone says is going to be internally coherent and create like an inherent coherent conceptual system. Like, I might say something in the morning, which then in the evening I say something that's kind of incompatible with, but I somehow believe both of these things to be the case at the same time, even though they actually contradict one another, or expressing propositions which can't be true at the same time, or interpreted as expressing propositions which can't be true at the same time by other people. And so I'm kind of, it's like I want to make it so Kropotkin is as consistent as possible without necessarily kind of ignoring the possibility that he could just be accidentally contradicting himself. But yeah, so I'll try and think more about the angle of, is he responding to contemporary debates, and is that motivating his changing language?
Thank you, Zoe. I've got another question for you as well. Do you find the same contradictions in his definition of anarcho-communism?
Well, I think his definition of anarchist communism is very straightforward. Like, whenever he talks about it, he's just like, you have the collectivist program. We took the collectivist program of the International and extended it to the products of labor. And so it's not just collective ownership of the means of production and land. And we're different to, these other kinds of socialists in these like various senses. Like, he's always very straightforward when talking about what anarcho-communism is specifically. Which also I think is, can make sense, because it's like it already been defined quite clearly before he even began to think of himself as an anarchist communist. And he then essentially repeats these points that had already been developed independently of him, and that he was then told in conversations and during various congresses and this International, where he then switches to becoming a communist. And then he just keeps consistently repeating the exact same perspective on what it is. He just kind of updates various views on the technological feasibility of doing it during a revolution, as he learns a lot more about like greenhouses and things like that. But his basic definition of it is the same.
Thank you, and I'm going to abuse my power as chair of this session and ask Michael another question. So where would you say this instinctive sympathy is in most people every day? So I can think of an example when there's a homeless person on a busy high street. You'd think that instinctive sympathy would kick in, but most people just walk straight past and don't even look at the person or acknowledge them. So where is that instinctive sympathy here?
Yeah, that was a very good question. I think those kinds of questions I think are very sort of very fruitful areas to use more phenomenology on, to see how those kinds of things work. Because you can draw a comparison with certain kinds of perceptual fatigue. When you for instance, if you see something all the time, then you become blind to it, right? And I think something like that, sadly, can be might be able to be connected to something like sympathy as well, where I think if you I think one of the stories of the Buddha is a very, very clear one, where someone is in this one of the original stories of the Buddha, and I might be corrected here because I know there's at least one Buddhist scholar in the chat, I think in one of the original stories, he's raised as a prince, and he's kept away from any suffering in the world. And then when he comes into the world, the first time he sees a homeless man, he's horrified, absolutely horrified. But because we see it every day, are sort of accustomed to it. So it's I think in the similar way as with perception, I think it's something that can just be sort of numbed by continuous exposure, I guess. So then the question is, how do you build that up? I think one of the things that an approach like this does teach us is that what is important is definitely to try and get people, because trying to get people to imagine what it's like to be homeless is quite complex, but getting people, actually to engage with people who are unhoused, who are homeless, who are suffering, that is a much easier way to actually see people as people again. If you actually talk to, the homeless person in the street asking for money or something else, then they sort of regain their human status in your view of the world. I know that kind of makes it sound very objectifying, but I do think that's a problem, the objectification, and I think the way to I think we have to find different ways of trying to combat that, definitely.
Thank you. And Cord has a comment. I don't know if Cord, do you want to come on and ask this yourself?
Yeah, sure. The Gothic imagery in the Smith examples, kind of being lying in a cold grave, being prey to corruption, and Kropotkin taking over these examples almost exclusively from areas of torment and suffering. And I was wondering whether that kind of limits this account of perceptual, or this perceptual solution to the problem that Kropotkin seeks, that it and if that solution is also equally applicable to instances of play and those types of sociability that Kropotkin also talks about in mutual aid.
I don't see why they wouldn't be applicable to more positive, less Gothic instances. I think actually one of the in the same text that I've mainly been discussing, anarchist morality, toward the sort of latter half of the text, he starts talking about anarchist morality beyond mere, he says beyond mere reckoning, I think is the words he uses. So beyond just tit for tat, we actually want to excel in life, and we want to be great, and we want to overflow with power and passion, or whatever terms he uses. And one of the main points he makes there is that is very inspirational to others, and I think that's another. I don't think he uses the word sympathy there anymore, but I think that's a very good example of sympathy in a positive way. That if we strive to be the best we can be, and we live as a bright flame, and we don't vegetate, as he says it, that's a way in which other people can also sympathize with that, pick up that energy, pick up that power, and be inspired. And I think in the same way you can extend it to things like play, definitely.
Okay, thanks.
Sean has commented saying that he thinks Bennett Brazelton's paper at 1 p.m. on Friday will be very interesting within the previous discussion about the limits of mutual aids. So everyone's welcome to come and listen to that. And I don't think we've got any more questions. And I think this session is going to end at 12 o'clock, so we're all going to be thrown out. So all that's left to say is thank you to Michael and Zoe for their interesting papers. And at 1 p.m, we have the next session coming up. This is Kropotkin and Global Ecologies. And that features papers from Pascal Siegrist and Shang Wang. So we'll see you all back here at 1 o'clock, hopefully. Thank you very much. See you soon.